And it's Friday night with Byline Times with me, Peter Jukes.
And me, Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't usually tell you. Well, coming up. Where are you from?
Well, I think the question is, Peter, where are you really from?
Indeed, as the 2021 census creates a race row across the media, and there's some rows in the palace too, we'll be trying to shed more light than heat. We'll be talking to Professor Jonathan Portes about what these new census figures really reveal about changing Britain. Also to our regular columnist, Otto English, about whether Enoch Powell's Britain is really returning and the apparent swamping of this country by unbelievers. And finally, to Dr. Shola Mos-Shogbamanu about that row in the palace.
But as you know, because we always say it, we couldn't do any of this without you. Byline TV is your independent TV channel. So if you do like what we do, then join us. You can head over to byline.tv/join, our own unique platform, and sign up. You'll be joining a growing Byline community and have access to all sorts of extras, such as a podcast, behind the scenes with our producers, documentaries, including that of John Sweeney, Compromat. And for tonight's purposes, importantly, you'll be able to join us for the After Dark Q&A, which takes place every week after our live show ends.
And if we're looking a bit tired, as we always say, we've got other things on the boil. We'll tell you about our new project at the end of the programme, Byline Supplement. We're about to start work on the new print edition next week. And also every week, as you can see in a moment, we do our digital front page. That's right. We produce 25 stories a week, free for everybody to view on the bylinetimes.com website. And our headline this week is a great exclusive of our own, isn't it, Hardeep?
Yes, it's an investigation by our reporters, Sian Norris and Sasha Lavin, and they contacted police forces in England and Wales, and of those responses they received, it has emerged that more than 4,000 incidents of rape and sexual assault have taken place in hospital settings over the past 4 years. Shocking statistics which have prompted the Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary, Wes Streeting, to demand an urgent investigation into this by the NHS. So you can go over to bylinetimes.com and check out that investigation and many others.
There's also a great story on there about a close associate of Abramovich's apparently helping to found an all-parliamentary group. So it's always a lot of news we have coming out of the website, and what drives our work is actually news, and then we tend to do a lot of analysis on top of that, and that's partly what's going on with Byline Supplement, isn't it, Hardeep? So we've launched today, this week rather, a new Substack, which is kind of like a magazine-y weekly version of our Byline Times work. It brings together all the stuff we put on the TV, on the podcast, some of the stuff on the paper, which all make it way back into the paper, by the way, and unique material with a US angle, because we have two great US correspondents. So it's called bylinesupplement.com. As I said, those of you who subscribe to the paper, you will get a lot of that content edited coming into the paper. But if you want to read it now, get it delivered to your inbox. That's the great thing about Byline Supplement. And the other thing is Elon Musk, isn't it, Hardeep?
Elon Musk, exactly. We can't be sure what's going to happen to our fantastic town square where we found so many of you when we launched Byline Times. So to not be at his whim or the whim of any other tech oligarch, we have decided to create a community elsewhere online. So if you are interested, check out bylinesupplement.com. It's our new Substack. But Peter, it's been an extraordinary week in terms of a number of issues coming together, which we're going to focus on in the show. And issues that we've discussed quite a few times on this show, whether they be race, the media, and the establishment.
Well, that's very interesting, Hardy. This time last year, we co-wrote an article whether ethno-nationalism, i.e. the legacy of Enoch Powell, had taken over from that of Edward Heath, had a famous battle Conservative Party in the late 60s, early 70s, after Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech and the threat he thought within 10 years, 20 years, the country would fall apart if immigration continued in the way it did. We haven't seen the country quite fall apart. And that article last year provoked some controversy. It was based on, by the way, not observations we'd just made, but two prominent Conservatives, former Conservatives Peter Oborne and Dominic Grieve, that the Conservative Party was heading in this ethno-nationalist route. Not exclusively that, and I know when Jonathan joins us in a moment, he has a slightly different angle on what's happening in reality with the Conservative Party. But certainly this week, with Calvin Robinson, a commentator on GB News, putting on his Twitter profile in praise of Enoch Powell, quoting the Rivers of Blood speech. I believe he's deleted some of that material. It's certainly, we weren't completely on the wrong foot, were we there? There were some of these tendencies were coming up.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting because this week the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was asked about this race row that we'll come on to in terms of Buckingham Palace, and he said that it's right that the palace dealt with it, that he had individual experiences of racism in his past, doesn't think they'd happen today, but that the job is never done, which I thought was a much more balanced approach from him than compared to his Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and others in his party, which is really the concern that that wing is going more and more to the right.
Yes, and if you want to understand the nuances, the complexities of, you know, the sort of power-like tendency or the more liberal tendency of the Conservative Party, or across the board, and why people of colour might make comments which other people might deem to be racist, I recommend the work of somebody sat not so far away from me, Hadi Mathari on Byline Times. But in a moment, as I said, we'll be talking to Professor Jonathan Portes about the details of that census. But first, let us do something we don't like really doing, which is platforming a member of the right or far right, however you want to describe him, i.e. one certain Nigel Farage, because when those figures were released earlier this week, which showed the increasing makeup, the diversity of our capital cities, Nigel Farage, of course, had something to say. We'll debate in a moment with Jonathan whether what he says is accurate, fair, or informative. But meanwhile, here goes, health warning, Nigel Farage is coming up.
The Office of National Statistics figures are out today showing that London, Birmingham and Manchester are all now minority white cities. Massive demographic changes taking place in our country. More significantly for the country as a whole, it shows that only 46% now identify as Christian. So there is a massive change in the identity of this country that is taking place through immigration. You may think it's a good thing, you may think it's a bad thing, but here's the real point of this. The ONS now say in future they will not ask of the nationality or birthplace of those taking part in this census. 1 in 6 in England and Wales already born outside the UK. In future, they want to hide the true figures from you. That's the real standout from these numbers today. It's a scandal.
Fantastic to have Jonathan Portes with us in the studio. Professor at King's College London. He also writes regularly for Byline Times. And if you want light rather than heat, illumination about matters of population, economics, there's very few other people to turn to other than Jonathan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Peter.
So, we've just had Nigel Farage, you might have missed the clip, Jonathan, saying that what's happening is, that basically the main population centres of Manchester, London and Birmingham are no longer predominantly white. Interesting description. Also saying that immigration has led to this massive decline in Christianity. And also a strange thing, I don't know if you can inform us on, you take these questions in any order you like, that then the census is no longer going to ask people where their parents are from or something like that. Can you give some light? Because I'm not sure Nigel is the source of light here.
Well, the last one is particularly bizarre, actually. We'll get onto the serious stuff in a minute, but the first one is just completely mad because, as the Office of National Statistics have said, basically ONS have sort of thrown out and says, look, we're completely exhausted. We spent the last 2.5 years doing this bloody census. It's a lot of work. We've been grinding through it slowly, and now we're giving you the early results, actually, because what we got yesterday is very much preliminary results for the census. And, you know, they didn't put it in these terms, but we haven't really begun thinking about the 2031 census yet. So the idea that we've decided to cancel white people or cancel immigration or whatever in the next sentence isn't just wrong. It doesn't even make sense because they haven't even begun the very first stages of thinking about how exactly the 2031 census will work.
Right.
So this is, as I say, it's not wrong. It's just completely fantasy.
Some
So
fake news by Nigel Farage. Who would have thought?
So that one we can leave aside and go to the sort of more serious stuff. As numerous fact checkers have pointed out, so probably all your readers know, you know, the majority white thing is a bit of a red herring because London remains majority white, but it's not majority white British. London is now 37% white British, but 54% white. So London is a very diverse city. We white Brits are the largest single minority, but we're all minorities of one sort or another. And that is pretty much the same story in Birmingham and Manchester as well. In factual terms, he's incorrect. In the sort of the broader sense, is it true that our major cities have been transformed in many ways by the migration flows of the last, as we know, it was the 75th anniversary of Windrush this year, but of the last 75 years in general, and the last 25 in particular, that's clearly true. But of course, there was a very good line by the excellent John Burns-Murdoch, the data journalist for the FT today, who said, talked about Farage getting it wrong, and then said, yes, it's true that London isn't majority white British anymore. But if it's the British thing you're worried about, why are you using the phrase white British?
Right.
Brackets. I think we all know the answer to that one. Close brackets.
So to take us by that, because that will relate to what something we'll talk about later in the show, which is where are you from, you know.
Yeah. Well, so there are
a lot of British people who are British because they are born here, they have British citizenship, who are not white.
Right. So London remains overwhelmingly as it was, and this hasn't changed that much since the last census, actually. So about 3/5 of Londoners are born in the UK, and more than 3/4 of Londoners are British, have British passports.
So that hasn't changed in a way. That
hasn't changed very much.
Right.
Because we've had people coming in, we've had people going out. The biggest growth in London's population, of course, has been of that rather oddly named white other category.
Which was the European,
which primarily in this context, it refers to everybody who's white.
American.
But, yes, it refers to Americans. Could refer to a white South African if they choose not to identify as black African. But mostly it refers to white Europeans. Everything, from and the biggest growth there has been in people, particularly in the last 10 years, people from Romania, which there is now a substantial population in London, which simply hardly existed 10 years ago. So there are big changes. That's true.
There was also a lot of discussion around some of the results with regards to religion, wasn't there? And all this debate about is Britain still a Christian country? And we've seen, according to the preliminary findings, that fewer people identify as Christian now.
Yes, and that is a big change. But of course, that's not a demographic change as such, in the sense of, it is a social change, because it's not the case that we are it's not that unlike and you've sort of got two quite different stories going on here. One is that migration and the movement of people, and the other is how we ourselves are changing. Because of course the big shift, as again many people have pointed out, is not that that somehow we have fewer Christians and more Muslims. We have somewhat more Muslims.
Some commentators are trying to make that link, or
well,
suggest that immigration's going up and Christianity's going down.
So Douglas Murray tweeted that that the fact that England was no longer a majority Christian proved that his warning in his book of Strange Death of Europe 7 or 8 years ago, that we were going to be overrun by the Muslim hordes and Islam would displace Christianity, that proved he was right. He obviously, I don't know whether he was deliberately lying or just hadn't looked at what the census actually said, because of course the number of Muslims went from about 4-point-something% to 6-point-something%. The number of people with no religion has skyrocketed. So it's not, what's happened is that a lot of people who previously identified as Christian are no longer identified as Christian. And we don't know what, what's going on there. Are people less religious, or is it that people are actually, that most of us in the UK are, may or may not believe in God, may or may not have some spiritual identification, but are more comfortable saying I have no religion, and less comfortable saying I'm a member I affiliate with Christianity or the Church of England. So we don't know what's going on there, and doubtless there will be numerous research studies over the next few years which look at that. Meanwhile, there is a sort of one slight counter in the opposite direction, is that people of a migrant background are more likely to be religious, whether that's Muslim or Christian.
And particularly from Africa, where there's been a large... Right,
there's a growth in...
So Nigel Farage is long on all 3 points.
Yeah.
But particularly that one that immigration has anything to do with declining religious belief. Because if anything, religious belief for migrants is higher.
Yes, so and this is where you cannot talk with any great certainty about this at the moment, because these are preliminary results. In other words, we only have what we call the univariate analysis.
Right.
So we know that X% of the population are Christian. We know that Y% of the population are Black African,
right.
Ethnically Black African. We don't know the overlap.
And that's the next phase, is it?
That will be the next
multivariate.
Phase.
I love
multivariate, exactly. So there's lots of headlines, but from a research point of view, obviously, if you want to know what's really driving these things, you need to look at what the crosstabs.
Crosstabs. We love crosstabs.
Yeah.
Just one. From your point of view, pushing away. We'll talk again in a moment because Otto English will be joining us to talk more about the religious thing and also about some of the rows that erupted. Was there anything, just as somebody who's basically a data expert and demographic expert, which you said surprised you about these preliminary results?
I don't think there was anything that was that I've seen so far that we didn't know, because we have surveys in between, so it's not, and the census tells us that the surveys didn't get everything right. That there are things there which you didn't know. I think that the religion one is probably the biggest surprise, because that is where we don't have really as much survey evidence, whereas the migration and ethnicity stuff and the population makeup of London, we sort of knew that, right? There was nothing.
And this fulfills kind of trends that from 10 years ago and stuff you've been seeing. So nothing to be alarmed about.
There's lots to be interested in. I don't think there's anything to be alarmed about. I think the one thing which I think is very interesting, which we do not get data about from the surveys, because for any sort of interesting analysis, the sample sizes are too small, and which will really repay investigation, is inter-ethnic mixing, and in particular inter-ethnic partnerships. So there was a headline figure in the census data that about 12% or something of 12% of households included a partnership where the partners were from different ethnic backgrounds. But that headline is almost impossible to interpret, because I'm not quite clear what definitions of ethnicity they're using, what they mean, how it compares to other things. But obviously that's something that you know, if you want to know how our society is evolving and changing, that's something that you don't necessarily get just from the surveys. It's something you don't necessarily get from your own anecdote, you know, visible evidence. We all have our own anecdotes, of course, or personal experiences. But how people are actually integrating at the household and family level is something that's obviously hugely important to the evolution of society over the long run, and which actually we know rather little about between censuses. And once we get more detailed data, I was surprised by the headline number was even larger than I would have expected, but until we get more information, it's difficult to say exactly what it means, who is marrying or partnering with whom, and
but it could be an indicator of more social cohesion. That you know, it's the opposite of what Enoch Powell said. It's not rivers of blood; it's happy families.
Well, I mean, yes, exactly. I mean, I won't overstate that knowledge.
I'm a journalist. I have to overstate.
But I mean, I think it is interesting. I mean, I was on GB News this morning.
Oh my goodness!
With a guy called Rakib Ehsan, who is you know, sort of originally from the sort of Henry Jackson's Douglas
That's
Murray,
right.
And he and I disagree about a lot of things politically, and you know, but actually on the interpretation of the census, we were pretty much violently agreeing about this stuff, and both saying that you know, yes, this is expected. Yes, actually, it's broadly reassuring. Yes, it suggests that on the whole, Britain is a fairly successful multiracial democracy and society. And of course, there are lots of things to be worried about, but mostly these things seem to be going in the right direction. And he said very explicitly that those who wanted to use this, in meaning Farage and Murray and co, as a sort of reheated Powellism, should be ignored. And
well, that's very good. You may disagree now. Well, our next section we'll go to in a moment, Dr. English, whether Powellism can be reheated, and evidence, as you said, among certain commentators, Calvin Robertson, maybe Douglas Murray, is that it is. But before Otto English joins us, we'll just prelude a bit of what we'll be talking about later, which is any tensions in the royal family and apparently inflammatory remarks perhaps being made in the palace. Well, here's a trail of the up-and-coming documentary with Harry and Meghan.
Why did you want to make this documentary?
No one sees what's happening behind the closed doors. I had to do everything I could to protect my family.
When the stakes are this high, doesn't it make more sense to hear our story from us?
And now we're joined by Otto English. But Otto, before we get going, I must ask you, where are you from? I mean, really from?
I'm from London.
Where, though? Where in London?
London.
Lewisham. You're from Lewisham?
Where are your parents from?
Essex. No, actually, that's not true. My father was from London. My mother was from Stoke-on-Trent. So I suppose I'm a child of immigrants.
So we've been talking to Jonathan about the census, which has dominated a lot of discussion in the media this week. That leads us on to discussions within some of the more right-wing media, and also in terms of politics about Enoch Powell and Powellism. And I guess as Peter was saying to our audience earlier, we had Calvin Robinson, he's a GB News host. He changed his Twitter profile picture to Enoch Powell, said he was right about, you know, the rivers of blood that are coming our way because of these demographic changes. To what extent do you think he is exposing a current that is there within the right of this country, whether that be the Conservative Party or this sort of ecosystem of broadcasters and commentators that are quite close to people in positions of power.
So I found that very shocking indeed, that somebody who's not just a guest on a national broadcaster, but who has a show on a national broadcaster, thinks it's okay to put Enoch Powell in their header on their Twitter, and then when it gets called out, eventually changes it to the River Tiber, and then puts up on his Instagram page, which I was led to by a friendly third party, where he's put on his story, Enoch was right, proved me wrong underneath, inviting comments. Doesn't back down, nothing happens to him, GB News carries on, presumably the advertisers carry on giving GB News their money. That somebody can think that is okay, and more to the point that his employers and the advertisers clearly think it's okay in 2022 is frankly very shocking. I don't think it's a reflection on the rest of the country, but, you know, having, as I do, weighed in on that debate, you then come across all sorts of people. But what's disturbing in those, I mean, of course it's not reflective. You're talking to a few dozen or maybe a couple of hundred people maximum as you waste your time engaging with these people rather than just pressing the block button multiple times. What's worrying is that some of those people seem relatively normal. They're sort of, they're not the sort of normal screaming Twitterati sort of right-wing botty type people.
Would it be worth clarifying why it's so inflammatory? Because I think people forget, I mean, Hardy, you wrote a very good essay on this. Not only did he say that basically within 20 years, he said by the 1980s, this was the speech, our cities would be aflame, there would be just violence. He also said this very striking line, which, because he was a big colonial imperialist, wasn't he? And he was in India. What's the line?
The black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
White man will have the whip hand. So what that reveals to me, I don't know what you feel about this, colonial guilt. The whip hand was famously held through 300 years of slavery by the white man over the black man, if you're talking those crass terms. And he could not see anything but revenge for that.
So you've got to go with the context of the speech, which a lot of people miss. So he delivered that speech on the 20th of April, 1968, which is Adolf Hitler's birthday, 20th of April. That might have been a coincidence, but the timing of his speech was not a coincidence because it was 2 weeks exactly after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Right. So he actually references, a lot of people miss this, he references America a lot in the speech. So he's clearly referencing the civil rights movement in America and what he perceives to be the sort of dawning of a race war. And he's very explicit about that in the speech. And the speech itself, I remember on the anniversary, so that would have been in 2018, there was a huge outcry because the BBC actually broadcast it, and people like me said, oh, you can't go around broadcasting it. And then I remember, as a result, I listened to that programme and I actually read the speech, and I thought, actually, the BBC did a good thing there because they exposed what a rancid speech it was and what a small-minded and nasty man he was and how horribly out of touch that speech is with today. So people only ever quote well, he never said the rivers of blood, did he?
He said Tiber will be foaming there.
The other thing that's interesting about that speech, and also, and I think you're right, is that in that speech, he says several times that this is a threat that's always going to be with us because the people he was currently in that speech saying are causing problems, they're having children. And he says in the speech that those children are not British and that they will have children. So this threat is ever increasing. And I wonder whether there's, you know, to what extent does that context sit in an interesting way with, for example, some of the rhetoric we've had from Home Secretaries such as Priti Patel, such as Suella Braverman, around the people coming across the channel on boats, causing an invasion of the southern coast, that the dream is to send them to Rwanda. I mean, Jonathan or Otto, I mean, to what extent do you think that from people in the highest positions of power is making it much more acceptable for even people like Calvin Robinson, etc., to say these sorts of things without thinking that they're controversial?
I don't buy it, and I certainly don't buy the idea that Robinson says these things without thinking they're controversial.
Well, yeah.
I mean, this is pure. I mean, I actually think I would take completely the opposite view. I think to Otto, not about the analysis of Powell's speech, but about what this illustrates. I was around for the census 10 years ago, and indeed for the census 20 years ago when I was in government, and there was a lot less implicit or explicit Powellism than there was. Indeed, most of the coverage of the census focused, first of all, on the decline of Christianity point, which almost all commentators, including the right-wing press, fairly quickly identified as being not having anything to do with immigration, and much less about actually demographic change. There were a lot of stuff in 2011 about how London was no longer majority white British. The stuff earlier this week was a complete shrug, apart from the hysterical rantings of people like Robinson, who's clearly Farage, but who are clearly doing
Murray,
it.
who's foregrounded in the Times.
Well, I do find Murray, the fact that Murray is still taken,
I agree. That's extraordinary.
Disgusting.
Yeah.
But Robinson is going the same way as Majid Nawaz, isn't he? It's down that sort of rabbit hole, and eventually he will go a bit too far and get himself kicked off even GB News.
So for you, these parallels with Powell...
the Burns today, John Burns Murdoch was very good in saying that after the expression which I said, we know what you mean white people aren't British, referring to Farage's comments. But he said, thankfully, actually, nobody agrees. And if you look at the graphic in John's article, you'll see that 10 years ago, at the time of the last census, there were 10 or 12% of the population who did believe you needed to be white to be British. A minority, but not a completely insignificant minority, right?
Has that changed?
It's down to, it really is just the people who rant at Otto and me on Twitter.
So like 6%?
Or even less. I mean, it is. So we are down in the sort of people who believe that the Queen is a giant lizard in human form.
Yes.
Type.
You're saying she's not?
on that funny note,
I was just trying to give you a lead.
Exactly, Jonathan knew exactly what I was looking for there. But that brings us to the palace. So the other development, if you like, which has dominated debates in the media, perhaps among a select few people with loud voices, is this incident that happened at Buckingham Palace, a reception that was thrown by the Queen Consort Camilla to raise awareness about abuse and domestic violence against women and girls. And Ngozi Fulani, who is the founder of Sister Space, a very award-winning charity, attended, and it has emerged through her own account that she was asked several times at that reception by Lady Susan Hussey, who was a lady-in-waiting, where she was from. And when Ngozi Fulani said Hackney, she asked her again, but where are you from? Where are your people from? And has subsequently resigned or stepped away. What do you make of this, Otto? Does it prove that Harry and Meghan's allegations about racism within the royal family were true?
Well, obviously, we don't know the ins and outs of what goes on in Buckingham Palace, but the story rings very true, doesn't it? I mean, it just rings so true. And again, the defence that people were trotting out was, she's 83 and all this kind of thing. Well, that isn't a defence, but also, why do we still have, our head of state living in this palace where you've got ladies in waiting, octogenarian ladies in waiting, hosting or co-hosting these state events? Her views clearly were totally inappropriate. I think they were very resonant of a certain type of British person. but age is no excuse. I mean, she was 38 when Enoch delivered the Rivers of Blood speech, wasn't he? So, although at the time the polling showed in '68 that 75% of British people agreed with Enoch Powell. So maybe there is a sort of residue among that age group. Although my own parents, who were a similar age to that, changed their views quite dramatically over time, and I think most people probably have on that as well, regardless of age group. You probably know, Jonathan.
I think, yes, I think that's right. Regardless of age group, I think people have, there's both been a cohort effect and a period effect, as the demographers say. So it's both.
You have to explain that.
Both of the old people die out and new ones come in with different views, but also people change their views. And you have both of you. It's hard to separate out those effects in cross-sectional data, but ultimately you can.
I love data.
I mean, I'm not going to comment on the royal family because I know nothing about it. But I mean, I would say I said the same thing that I said about Douglas Murray. A conversation with Ash Sarkar about saying why does Murray not treated like Tommy Robinson? And she said, well, it's because he went to Eton and he talked that way. And my response was actually that rings true, and it just goes to show that in this country everything that's about race is also about class, and everything, and vice versa. And that is precisely what's going on here, right? This is what happened in the past was not just about race; it was also about class and vice versa.
And also border. I mean, what do they always ask, don't they? The Queen when she'd turn up. I only saw her once to open Robinson College in the 80s, and I did notice she was bright orange, our former Queen. That makes you rest in peace because of the makeup. But they always ask, where are you from? Did you come far? And so maybe it's just also the.
Well, that was apparently her line. Well, that was apparently the Queen's line. She always said, have you come far? To everybody, apparently. It was like her sort of opening gambit. But yes, I mean, the fact that this lady in waiting appears to have drilled down on the question, you might possibly forgive someone for asking the question in the first place. But then, it's a bit Oscar Wilde territory, this, isn't it? But to ask once is unfortunate. To keep asking is racist. I mean, if you keep asking, it's clearly racist. And again, I found it very dispiriting to be pointing this out and to have some apparently normal people defending her. And I think, as Jonathan has identified, that goes back to this deference in this nation for the so-called self-defining upper classes, which is very, very peculiar.
I'm going to bring in Hardeep here because she writes about this, so it's unfortunate she just asks questions and doesn't answer them. Do you find it interesting that with somebody like Calvin Robinson, as we've also had in this to a certain extent with Braverman and Priti Patel, that now it's people of colour who are accused of making racist statements?
Do I find it interesting?
Does it show what Jonathan's saying, cross-variate tabs, I don't know how you put this, but as you get to a less racist society, you will notice that, if you're genuinely anti-racist, you have to accept that people of colour can be racist.
Yeah, exactly. Because people are individuals and they have their own ideologies. They can be partisan politicians. They will have had their own experiences in life, which will have given them a certain perspective on things. I think it does add a different dimension to the debates, though, because it sort of raises questions which can be perplexing for some people. And we've seen this with the Home Secretaries. How can we even level the charge that some of these acts could be seen as racist or racialized because they are people of colour? And I think you're right. I think we live in a society where we can be individuals and we can hold the views we want and the political ideologies that we want. And as these people of colour are being given more prominent positions, whether that's in the media or politics, you're going to get that same range of opinions that you get anywhere else in society.
But one of the things that you've noticed with the front bench, the Conservatives, with the House of Parliament, in the House of Commons for Liz Truss's only PMQs, I think, and noticed that the front bench of the Conservative Party was quite diverse, but not the backbenches, was the other way around with Labour. And one of the cross-variates you notice, whether it's Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, probably the wealthiest Prime Minister we ever had, or Kwasi Kwarteng, the class in the Conservative Party seems to trump ethnic background.
Well, it's interesting. This is where Jonathan is completely right in that these issues are about two things. So with the Conservative front bench, it's about race and class. And we've all, Rishi Sunak is our first Prime Minister of colour. He's also our richest Prime Minister. And that is the entire point. The whole cabinet is full of people who went to private schools, who have come from socially mobile backgrounds. And so diversity is not just about changing visibly what a political party or an organisation looks like. It's much more about class, it's about experience, it's about diverse thought. And I don't think just picking on one topic, one issue is necessarily going to address the failings in other areas.
Before we go to Dr. Shola Bogmamanu, have you any final thoughts yourself, Otto, on this week? When I know you're doing your book and Otto's writing his second book to catch up on fake history. What's the new one called?
I can't reveal that.
You can't reveal that yet. It's been
nearly
buried away, 100,000 words.
Yeah,
so we plucked him out of obscurity.
Yeah.
It's a bit sort of, dazzled by the lights, aren't you? What about this week? So, in a way, Jonathan's given us sort of rather optimistic thoughts.
I'm normally very optimistic as well. It's just, and you're right. You know your data, and I'm optimistic about people themselves. It's the media feeling they can do it, and the fact that these people feel they can do it without any repercussions. That's what worries me. When Katie Hopkins said some outrageous and revolting things 5 years ago or whatever, she was pretty swift. Eventually, not pretty swiftly. It was. She kept turning the outrage knobs dial up and up and up and up. And it reminded me of that Southeast Asian phrase about riding the tiger. You ride the tiger, you dance through the jungle, and then one day you have to get off and the tiger eats you. And that's what Katie Hopkins reminded me of. It was like she was getting ever more manic. I do see that happening with this Calvin figure, but I do feel that we shouldn't really be letting people get away with it.
So that to you, Jonathan, a point to you is obviously the demographics are showing that people, the general population, is more tolerant, and integrating better than certainly Enoch Powell predicted. But one bit of news that emerged this week was from Neil Basu, as the former commander of counter-terrorism, that all the stuff about Meghan and Harry had led to really serious threats to their lives at the time when they alleged that they were getting security withdrawn. So in a kind of what they call a stochastic terrorist way, do we have to be aware of these extreme forms? Not because the most population agree with them, but extreme elements in our society act on. Even some Piers Morgan inflamed about Meghan, that could still lead to trouble.
Yes, obviously we do. Obviously, equally, for all their faults, the police, in that area, the police here and security services seem to have done a much better job than, say, in the US. Obviously, their job is much harder in the US, where you have guns around. But we have had, we had that incident at Dover recently of a racist, we don't know yet, but it is presumed to be somebody radicalized, a lone person radicalized through the internet and for hatred of migrants. And that's unfortunate. But equally, those incidents in the UK so far have been fairly rare. So yes, it's something to worry about, but I don't think it sort of changes the broad trajectory of our society.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jonathan and Otto, for that light. And now we'll see a quick clip of more details of an eyewitness to this incident in the palace. And then after that, we'll be talking to Shola, as already trailed, about her experience of this kind of aggressive questioning and what she thinks is happening in society.
Myself, Ngozi, and another campaigner were standing together, three of us, black women. We were approached by a member of the royal household who came over, began the usual small talk. Very quickly, she zoomed in on Ngozi and asked her where she was from. Ngozi said she was from Sister Space, which is the organization she leads. But what followed was almost an interrogation. There was question after question about where she was really from, where her people came from, what her nationality was. And Ngozi said, I'm British. I was born in the UK, but that wasn't enough for this person. This person really wanted to extract some other information about her heritage, her African heritage. And it was really uncomfortable. In the end, it was a prolonged encounter over several minutes. And in the end, it left, all of us feeling like perhaps we didn't belong at the event. Perhaps we weren't truly welcome.
And now we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Shola Mostrob-Babamu. Shola, welcome back to Friday Night with Byline Times. So, the incident at the palace received huge amounts of coverage this week. Yes. Let's drill down into your insights, right? How common is this type of experience, this type of questioning?
Okay, how common is racism to Black people? It's incredibly common. It's part of our lived experiences every single day in different shapes, form or manner. And the reality is, what happened to Ngozi Fulani in the interrogation she got from Lady Susan Hussey, it exemplifies the heightened entitlement that some white people have towards Black people. On what earth does, in any way, shape, form, or manner, did Lady Susan Hussey think that she had the right to know all that she was demanding to know of Susan? Of Ngozi Fulani. Ngozi Fulani answered every question posed to her and every variation of the same question. But that did not satisfy Lady Susan Hussey. But let's even start with the first thing Lady Hussey did. She had the temerity, the arrogance, the utter caucasity to take her hand and move a hair. This is a perfect stranger, people. To see her name. You couldn't ask what her name is? And then proceeded to go, where are you from? Where are you really from? No. Where are your people from? Okay, no. When did you get here? Oh, I see, I'm going to have a challenge to get you to tell me where you're from. Ah, you're Caribbean. Even though Ngozi said, I'm from Hackney. That's where she just come from. Okay, if that's not, I was born in Britain. I'm British. Oh, no. Okay, and when did you get here? After she said, I am British, I was born here. Surely the conversation at any point in time should have ended after she said, I am British. Where are you from? If where I live doesn't satisfy you, if the fact that I'm born here doesn't satisfy you, I think Ngozi Fulani exemplified such dignity and grace in continuing that conversation, because I would have been tempted to make good trouble.
And Shola, do you think there's a misconception that still is too prevalent in society, in white society, that that racism is actually somebody going up to somebody and punching them because they're Black? It's often not that, right? It is that, and that's that's extreme.
Yes.
But racism and racialized discourse operates in many smaller, polite ways.
Absolutely. I say that Britain has a first degree in normalizing casual racism. And in Britain, people think that being polite is perfectly fine, as long as their tone was calm and quiet. Surely that was not racism, when that was equally as violent as being slapped in the face. But when you look at the backlash against Ngozi Fulani, not Lady Hussey, those who are looking to defend Lady Hussey are now trying to discredit Ngozi Fulani with every single ammunition they can think of, made up stuff. But none of that changes the fact that Lady Hussey had that conversation the way she had the conversation, and that she should never have done that. They don't want to admit that. In fact, apparently some are accusing Ngozi Fulani of deliberately setting up Lady Hussey. Now, how would Ngozi Fulani have known that, that Lady Hussey, a woman she doesn't know, would have made a beeline for her at this event? How?
Nigel Farage made these extraordinary claims saying that she had a tape recorder with her and all sorts of things.
Which she did not, of course not. Yeah.
In terms
But Nigel Farage is a waste of space.
In terms of people understanding, white people understanding why this line of questioning, what that does to a person of colour.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about that, Shola, so people can get an insight into, because a lot of people were weighing in on the debate and saying, but it's just, you know, I don't mind being asked where I'm from and all this sort of thing. But can you explain, when a person of colour is consistently asked that question, what happens internally in that moment?
I don't want to. I'm tired. Why should I have to explain something that common sense should tell you is wrong?
And demeaning.
Exactly. If I did that to you in such a way that you start to get the feeling, and I'm making it blatantly clear that I am doubting who you are, doubting your identity, doubting every word that you say to me, what else needs to be said? Why should I have to come to my white brothers and sisters and persuade you and move your hearts and minds? You move your own damn hearts and minds. Stop wasting my time. And so I don't have better things to do with my energy. I mean, this is emotionally and mentally exhausting. I mean, through the whole Black Lives Matter movement during the George Floyd thing, there was a whole lot of conversations. People wrote a whole lot of books. There were lots of documentaries, TV stuff. You mean you did not learn anything out of that? So that 2 years down the line, we're still having the same conversation. In fact, when you look at those who are defending her, including the apologist racial gatekeepers, the racial gatekeepers are black and brown people. I don't mind if somebody asks me where I'm from. But that is not what Lady Susan Hussey asked her. Lady Susan Hussey asked her, where are you from? Where are you really from? No. Where are your people from?
Yes.
No. Okay, when did you first get here? After she said, I was born here. I'm sorry. Is she asking when her mother and father had sex and she was conceived? When did you first get here? And then she goes, oh, I see I'm going to have a child. Those are the questions that were posed. At what point would you, my white brother and sister, go, okay, I've had enough of this. This is rude.
Well, Hadi, with a Punjabi background, people ask that. Also, a very interesting analogy, I think, is that, you know, people, Muslims, are asked to, fortunately, it's stopped now. What do you think about ISIS? What do you think? And that becomes completely exhausting. I mean, and maybe, you know, women who may have made remarks understand Lady Hussey. What if they always ask in their workplace, are you okay, love? Are you sure you're in a good mood today?
Or why don't you have children?
Why didn't you have, it would drive you mad. And so people should. Is there a space, Shola, do you think, to open up this ignorance? Because in a way, what was interesting, she assumed, didn't she, that Lady Hussey was from a Caribbean background. She was from an African background. That's right.
She had a racial bias towards Ngozi Fulani, and what she wanted was for Ngozi Fulani to confirm her racial bias of her, which is why every single answer to the same question and the variation of the same question did not satisfy her.
But the question is, you could ask Lady Hussey where she came from, and eventually the answer would be Africa. Because we all come from Africa.
Probably.
And so, you know, it's just at which point in time, I don't know where she could, probably Norman or maybe German or something like that. Yeah. But is there a space there to educate people, for example, that we all come from Africa? That's where, you know, after
there is, look, if we as ethnic minority communities who are constantly racialized are learning every single day, because we're not adapting to the racism, we're having to survive and thrive in spite of, and all of the structural barriers facing us. If we're having to deal with that and learning how these racial structural barriers are evolving, because you see, we have a whole lot of work to do. I'm sorry, why can't our white brothers and sisters learn as well?
But of course, it's not your job to teach them.
Exactly.
It's our job.
So when you talk about, is there space? The space is always there. And I'm saying that we're not even given the platform to create spaces. Some of us have gone ahead and tried to create the space, but nobody needs to give you a chair for you to sit at the table. So to my white brothers and sisters, wake the heck up. It is not about somebody helping you to progress in your understanding. You need to take responsibility. And so when I see all of these apologists and these racists and people are deliberately demeaning and basically they're being racist to Ngozi Fulani again.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing. All of them are doing this again. It means that they
uppity, you know, it's that
totally.
classic, yeah.
And what it shows is that Lady Susan Hussey exemplifies a certain population of Britain. And all those who are seeking to defend her because she is them and they are her.
Did you hear Jonathan, though, talk quite encouragingly about the proportion, like 75% supported Powell in 1968. 16% thought, I think was the statistic, in 2011, that Britain, it was bad that it was getting more ethnically diverse. And now, according to that, it's tiny. So these people maybe are the past and not the future?
No, they're the present.
Ah, well.
That's the problem, okay? They're not the, we can't even, when we talk about the past, is because the past still has an impact on the present. And the problem is those who are in the present still have the platform and the power. So even with the small proportion you talk about, okay, it's probably going to be the same proportion that's put us in the mess that we're in with Brexit. But it ended up being the majority. And you have to also understand that it's one thing to have, I would say, my white brothers and sisters who don't get it, and thank Jesus for the white brothers and sisters who get it. But then you have the racial gatekeepers who want to go, well, I'm proud of my heritage, so you can ask me where I'm from. If you ask me where I'm from, I will answer the question. If your question makes sense, I will answer the question. Not a problem. You can ask me what my name means, where's my name from, yada, yada, yada. We can have that conversation. But I think I've reached the grand old age. I know I don't look it, but celebrate. I've reached the grand old age that I have zero patience for nonsense. I'm allergic to nonsense. So as far as I'm more than happy to dismiss certain people, because you see, I'm no longer at that age when I used to do that in my 20s and 30s, when I can almost hear my mother's voice. Shall I behave yourself? It's okay. Don't need to get everything. Behave yourself, just be polite. And then I get home and I go, I wish I'd said that. Now I say it.
Shola.
I will go to bed knowing I said what I need. Let them go and still, oh, that's Shola said that's me.
Shola, we're grateful for you saying what you say. Everybody should be able to speak out. You speak out so eloquently and powerfully. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We are going to have a Q&A, a classic Q&A in about 5 minutes, about 3 minutes past 8, with their team, with Stephen Colgrave, my co-founder, and George will be joining us, myself and Hardeep. So if you sign up, you can ask us questions about all our activities, things that are coming up, like the Brexit documentary, like Byline Supplement, anything else you want to ask, but only, unfortunately, if you sign up and support the TV station.
Yes. So that leaves us with just saying thank you for joining us. If you do like what we do and you want to join us for the Q&A, byline.tv/join. Do check out bylinetimes.com and our new supplement as well. We'll be back next week, 7 p.m. Friday night with Byline Times. See you then.